Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you had a lovely lunch. My name is Helen Beal. I'm here from Range 4. I'm going to be talking with you about neuroscience and DevOps this afternoon. Some of you may be thinking, what's the connection between neuroscience and DevOps? I know this is quite a technical conference. I've looked at a lot of the other tracks. I know there's a lot of things like Kubernetes and microservices and things going on. So hopefully I can try and explain why I'm here talking about this. When Range 4 started around 7 years ago planning to help people with DevOps solutions, we all came from a tooling background. My most recent job had been in a deployment automation company. So we felt naturally that talking about DevOps would help us people build tool chains and things like that. But actually what we discovered happened was we got engaged with lots of organisations and they all kept saying the same thing to us. The thing that we're really struggling with is culture, and this is reflected in this Gartner article here where they interviewed lots of people, and half of them said the biggest challenge for them adopting DevOps was actually around people, not around technology, not around information, and not around process, but actually the people thing. And we kind of already had a bit of an inkling about this at Range 4. We'd been obviously following the market and the thought leaders, and John Willis and Damon Edwards had said after they did the first DevOps days in Mountain View, they came up with this acronym, which I often refer to as the elevator acronym, in that it's a bit like an elevator pitch, in that if you were stuck in a lift with somebody and had 30 seconds to explain what DevOps is all about, you could use CALMS to explain that. And the C in CALMS has always said DevOps is a big part of it is about culture. So we knew this. So our customers kept on asking us, culture's really hard, we don't know how to change it, we know we need to change it. So we developed things in our discussion that helped us quantify what culture looked like. And we discovered that you could do that. You could say sort of how much trust people felt there was in an organisation, whether people thought it was bureaucratic or generative. There are lots of different ways to quantify culture. But we still found it very hard to think about how to actually change the culture. It's a kind of nebulous thing. It's quite difficult to grasp, and you can name cultural artifacts like organisational why and values and things, but quite hard to say we want to move this people feeling like this about their organisation to a different place. Added to all of that, we're all technologists, so we're quite used to talking about things like bits and bytes, but not really that good at talking about this softer stuff, these emotions and these feelings, the kind of stuff that comes up at the water cooler or down the pub in the English world. So we kind of worked on this, and then we started to discover that actually underlying all of the things that we could see as culture, really the core of it was the way that people behaved. And this was kind of a pivotal moment for us because we realised that we could change behaviours through introducing practices. So one of my favourite examples is if you're having trouble getting the developers, for example, thinking about quality, you could ask them to try and practice test-driven development or TDD, which makes them think about the test and the quality up front in the development cycle. So we started noticing all these subtle patterns the way we could change behaviour. And as part of that, we really started thinking about, well, what drives behaviour? And then we thought, well, it's the brain. We all have a brain, all exhibit behaviours. And that led us into the world of neuroscience and then understanding that, again, as technologists, kind of essentially scientists, we like neuroscience because it is data-driven. Data-driven is a key kind of cultural behavioural word that we use a lot in DevOps. So it gives us evidence, proof, and things that we can trust. So, as I said, we've all got a brain. Let's start with some quite interesting facts about our brain. Whilst it's only 2% of our total body weight, it uses 20% of the blood and oxygen that goes around our body. It's a hungry thing, hungry organ. It's also very fatty compared to other parts of our body, so it's like very energy intensive. There's a lot of blood vessels in it. Dehydration affects our cognitive abilities very quickly, and we've got about 86,000 neurons in the brain as well. So there's lots of things going on in there. 86 billion neurons. So lots and lots of different types of neurons as well. So actually 10,000 specific different types of neurons. We're going to talk about a couple of different ones today. But effectively what you've got over here is a neuron, and the way that a neuron talks to another neuron is via an axon. And you can see something there called the myelin sheath as well. The myelin sheath, I'm not going to talk about too much today, but it's basically like protein that wraps around the axon to enable fast flow of the information. It's like almost like a network cable. And we kind of build those as we build our neural networks or our neural circuits. So as these neurons build connections via axons to other neurons, they become neural circuits. And then when we look at the brain as we go through this chat, we're going to see how different parts of the brain do different things. So bearing in mind that we all have brains, one of the things that we're trying to do when we ask organisations to evolve by using and adopting DevOps practices and principles, we're essentially asking a bunch of humans, and we have quite a wide range of customers that range for us. That could be 200 humans, it could be 20,000 humans. We're asking a bunch of human brains to learn different ways of working. So without exception, all of our customers are in a position where they are transitioning from waterfall to agile at different speeds, with different levels of success, but we are effectively asking a bunch of humans to think and work in a different way from what they've learned before. So Barry O'Reilly wrote a book, I think it was published last year or early this year. It's called Unlearn, and it's about this concept of unlearning the things we've already learned. So it's all very well if you join an organisation and you've never really worked anywhere before, you've never come out of university and learned some concepts there. But if you've been in an organisation, for example, as a project manager, and you've learned Prince 2, and you know all of that, and you know how the systems work, and you're good at doing Gantt charts and organising milestone meetings, it can be quite difficult to move to a product backlog-centric environment. So, as Barry explains here, unlearning isn't necessarily about kind of resetting the brain and taking everything away that we've already learned, but it's about building upon it and being open to these new ideas. So building upon those neural networks and circuits that we've created. So there is this concept of mindset. So the concept of mindset goes something like along the lines of, there are two different types of humans. Some have the growth mindset and some have a fixed mindset. And only growth mindset people are open to learning. And this is fairly kind of well accepted around the world. It came from a lady called Carol Sweat, who is a Stanford psychologist. And lots of people talk about mindset in this kind of concept. Some people have got the mindset and some people don't have the mindset. But what's quite interesting about neuroscience is it introduces us to this idea of neuroplasticity, so the brain is plastic. And I think this really challenges this idea that some people can't learn. And actually research has shown that simply by knowing about neuroplasticity opens people's mind up to learning. So it makes people more willing to think about what an agile practice looks like. And what's very interesting is that over and above kind of addressing this fixed mindset problem, what we can actually see through the research is how our learning shapes our brain. So we get different shapes of the neural networks and models in our brain as we learn different things. So to give you some specific examples from research, we know that London taxi drivers have a bigger hippocampus, and within the hippocampus there's something called the entorhinal cortex, which is effectively our GPS system. It's like our spatial awareness. Now, our taxi drivers in London have a bigger hippocampus than our bus drivers. And that's because our bus drivers drive the same routes most days, whereas our taxi drivers have something that we call the knowledge in London, which basically means they have to have a map of pretty much the whole of London in their heads in order to be able to navigate around. Another example, if you are bilingual, there are functional changes where your left inferior parietal lobe, which is there, I love all these words that you get when you get into the neuroscience stuff, is larger than monolingual brains. So there is something going on in that lobule that can handle the multiple languages. Another example for you from research, the grey matter, or the cortex volume, but particularly in the motor cortex areas, which are these two areas, and the superior parietal area, which is the one above the one we were just looking at, they are bigger in professional musicians. So practicing music, so practicing the act of playing an instrument and listening to music also has an effect that can be observed in the brain muscle. Just a little fun one because I quite like squirrels. Of course, mammals, we all have a similar brain. We're going to talk about the lizard brain probably in a minute as well. Squirrels' brains actually grow in the autumn because what happens is they gather lots of nuts and they bury all the nuts, and they actually create maps in their brains of where the nuts are. So their brain matter increases so that they can remember where they hid all their food. So we know now a little bit about how we learn and how our brains can change. Let's just talk about the actual act of learning on a day-to-day basis. So if we talk about working memory, take a look at this just for a few seconds. Try and memorise some of these. Who can tell me one that was on there? Yeah. So a few. Let's try this. Have a look at this one. Again, take a few seconds, memorise them. Who can tell me ones that were on that one? BBC, DNA, MRI, RAF. Easy, right? It was actually the same letters, just in a different order. But the brain, the frontal lobe, which is our working memory, can only handle about 3 chunks of information at once. But the BBC, because we know what the BBC is, that's 1 chunk. RAF is 1 chunk. Whereas when you're trying to remember those ones, each set of 3 is effectively 3 chunks. So that tells us that our working memory can't store that much, right? So we need to kind of think about that when we're hoping people that will learn, not trying to give them too much information, but also thinking about what happens next in the learning and how learning can be affected. So as we practice things, as we learn those different sets of patterns, as we practice things, the activity moves to a different part of our brain and we consolidate these processes. So we've all heard the old adage, practice makes perfect. It's about changing the way the brain works, which I'm going to explain in a little bit more detail in a minute. But in DevOps, we talk a lot about the improvement charter. Anybody here heard of the improvement charter? Anybody practice it? Few of you. So the word charter, like all of these words that are Japanese, comes from the Toyota Production System, or TPS, school of thinking, so lean. And charter is what we do, for example, when we're learning martial arts, and it's about repeating a pattern and over until it becomes kind of automated. So we have this concept of automaticity, which happens in the brain. So effectively, and we're all very comfortable with these words, things like schemas, we kind of get this. Effectively, as our working memory builds up those chunks of knowledge, it starts moving that information back into the brain, and it takes much less effort. So you can see here, brain very, very active on the working memory, trying to learn new stuff, and here it's automated the tasks, and it's much more simple. Anybody ever driven home from work and not remembered how they drove home when they got home? Yes, that's an example of automaticity going on in your brain. So that's great, clever little thing, the brain, but again, it just slightly exacerbates this problem that we've got. We're asking some people to change the way that they're working. We've built all these patterns in our brain, we've built our myelin sheaths, we're all very efficient, and now we're asking people to change. And this is where we need to think about what people's reaction is when we ask them to change. So I have some slides that I often use, but it's got somebody on stage, and he says, who wants to change? Sorry, he says, who wants change? And everyone goes, yes, I want change. Who wants to change? And people are like, a lot more nervous, don't really want to change. And then who wants to lead the change? And nobody wants to lead the change. When we do some of our discovery work, we always ask people what their appetite for change is, and everyone always scores themselves quite high. But the reality is a little bit different. Who in the room is in an organisation that is going through some kind of transformation right now? Agile transformation, DevOps transformation, reorganisation. So lots and lots of you. It's a very popular word. It's about kind of revolution, isn't it? It's revolutionary change. We're going to do something big, and it's going to be, we've got like this big vision of what's going to happen. I kind of prefer the word evolution, which is going to become a little bit more apparent why I prefer this kind of more incremental approach. And what we're really talking about is kind of transitioning between these two states. So transitioning from an organisational model where we've got lots of separate teams or silos to things where we've got things that look more like autonomous cells, things moving from a model where we've got groups of SMEs or subject matter experts to places where we've got lots of small amounts of cross-functional people in these small cells, where we're not doing things in a big project way that's going to take 18 months to 3 years, but actually we're going to do things in small bits that are going to take 2 weeks at a time, that kind of thing. So we've quite a lot of transition going on, which causes a lot of disruption. And that means that people have to acclimate. So we're giving people a shock. So one of our clients at the moment is co-locating. They've basically kind of thrown their whole organisational model up in the air and are rebuilding it. It's been hugely disruptive. It's been very shocking for people, very emotionally difficult, and now they're into a place where people know what their new teams are, and they're starting to work together and starting to acclimate to the new ideas. And this is the kind of things that we're asking people to do. So I've mentioned a few of them already. Batch size, we want to go from big batch to small batch, small little units of work that are quick to get us feedback, that are easy to test, easy to release. We want to move away from these very skill-centric models that require lots of handoffs and create lots of waste and lots of unnecessary process, to places where authority is distributed and teams have control over their work and what they're doing. We want releases not to be something that happens at the weekend and everybody has to be on call for. We want them to be like breathing, so something that happens all the time, so it's very painless. Somebody once said to me, like driving on snow, and I said, clearly you're not British, because that's not what happens in the UK when it snows, it will grind to a halt. And that sentiment was kind of brought home to me a little bit later when I was on a flight to Reykjavik, and we'd just started the descent, and the pilots came on. They said, there's a blizzard on the ground at the moment, but hopefully we'll be able to land. Like, I thought, hopefully. And then I remembered that the Icelandic have a wicked sense of humour. Of course, they land in a blizzard all the time. So for them, it's like, it's a non-event. I've skipped one by accident there, but we're kind of decentralising thinking. We are making information useful, not just producing reports on a weekly basis, because that's all we've done, and we've always put them somewhere and no one ever looks at them. We're going to talk about this fail culture part quite a lot in a minute. Moving metrics around flow, and changing the definition of done to not be that silo-based thinking, but the end-to-end value thinking. So this is the kind of transition we're asking people to change. These are the behaviours and the thinking that we're asking people to embrace. However, there is a fundamental problem with a lot of this, and this is Britt Andreatta, who wrote a book called Wired to Resist, after she also wrote another book about learning, Wired to Learn. And what she discovered in her research is that we are actually biologically wired to resist change from an environmental perspective. So if you know anything about things like bees, you'll know that a bee will notice that if something has changed outside the hive, and they will go and inspect it. And this is why we don't like change, because it's a threat. So if we hadn't, in our early evolutionary kind of moments gone, that bush looks a bit different today. There could have been something in that bush that jumped out and ate us. So it's kind of this awareness. So we're not quite sure, but we think we could possibly attribute some of this to why a lot of change initiatives fail. And it is a lot of them. So these big transformations are renowned for being very difficult to land. And Britt's work suggests, again, going back to the neuroscience of individuals and figuring out what happens here. And this is kind of a bit of what happens. This is it's called the DevOps Kaizen. It's from Damon Edwards, or I attribute it to Damon Edwards. And it's this idea of big J's versus little J's. So you can see it quite easily. You've got time, you've got productivity. If you introduce a massive, big transformation, it's extraordinarily disruptive, and we see a big drop in productivity before we rise out the other side. If, however, you take a more evolutionary and incremental approach, and I often say that underpinning everything we do in DevOps is the concept of little and often, we do the little J's. So every little change we make has less impact, and our productivity is not impacted so much overall. And people are less upset and less likely to leave, and it's incredibly expensive to replace people, somewhere between 50 and 250% of their salary, depending on how experienced they are and how hard they are to replace and how long it takes their replacement to learn. So things that cause these problems then, why is it so difficult to cause or enact change on these very large levels? Well, we've got a lot of fear in a lot of the organisations we work with. I mentioned kind of bureaucracy versus generative, or bureaucratic versus generative organisations. We also have another type of organisation that we call pathological often. And these kind of pathological and bureaucratic organisations often have a culture where people are blamed and punished for mistakes. So there is very little tolerance for failure. Now, some of the organisations that we work with run things like, you could almost call it critical national infrastructure. Some of them absolutely are critical national infrastructure. And of course, we don't want to see a catastrophic failure in production. However, we do want to see people have autonomy to experiment and try new things. There's kind of different shades of grey of failure. But if we work in an organisation that is very command and control, is very kind of on a witch hunt if someone goes wrong. So not went wrong, how can we learn from it? More like, who did that? Let's get rid of them. This causes a lot of fear. And the problem with this in a place where we want to, thank you, learn, is there is a disturbance that happens in the brain if we're afraid. So what happens is we get a disturbance from our amygdala. So our amygdala is part of the lizard brain, it's often referred to. So if you imagine how vertebrates evolved, this is kind of where the brain started. So the lizards have these. That's why we often call it the lizard brain. Some people call it the limbic, which includes some other areas around there as well. But the amygdala effectively is responsible for our fight or flight response. So it's the bit that talks to our renal glands and pumps a load of adrenaline and cortisol into our body when we're feeling stressed, and does all the things like increases our lung capacity and pushes blood to our muscles and basically makes us ready to have a response. We don't just get that if we're faced with a lion, we get that in a social situation as well. So it's not just a kind of physical threat, physical kind of mortal threat in the field, it is also a social thing that happens. And fear, if we're afraid of, if we're in an environment where we feel blame and punishment, we feel nervous, what we get is a lot of disturbance again in our frontal lobe, which is that bit that we just tested that can only handle about 3 chunks of information at once. So it becomes much more difficult to take on new information if we are fearful. It also creates an avoidance response. This is only natural. If you're afraid of something, you'll try and walk away from it. So we need to, these are real kind of considerations when we talk about culture. So we have these conversations so often, particularly with senior leadership. So often I'm faced with leadership that say, we cannot fail. I know organisations like Nike won't allow the word fail. They have to have fast learning. And there is kind of a limited understanding sometimes out there that there are kind of many shades of failure. And of course, the thing we all want to avoid is catastrophic failure in production. We don't want to impact all our users and have our services down and not be able to transact, or have a news story written about us and have loads of brand reputational damage. We want to avoid that. But there are things that we can do to make change the tolerance for failure in an organisation. I've got behavioural sort of psychological safety ideas on the left-hand side and then systemic on the right-hand side. And they are equally important. So there are so many tools and techniques that we can use to make it safer for people to experiment. Key ones are things like limited blast radius. So don't deploy a change to everybody. Deploy it to a small amount of people, or use blue-green deployment facilities, or use things to really test your production capabilities like the Chaos Monkey and things like that. There are so many tools and techniques that can be used to improve it. So once we've got to a position where people are learning, people aren't scared to experiment, we can think about what we can do to encourage them to continue exhibiting the behaviours that we might want to see. So conversely, you remember it's fight or flight, that reward system, that threat reward system. It is a threat reward system. So the same bit, the amygdala, that will tell us to run away or punch something, is also the bit that helps us move towards something. So you remember we just talked about the avoidance response. We also have something called the approach response. And we can encourage these in people, so we can encourage people to walk towards or even run towards sometimes the behaviours that we want to see. So if we anticipate something, again, it's in that amygdala. We've got these neuromodulators that influence our frontal cortex. Again, we are excited and we want to go towards something. We're believing that we're going to see a reward, it's going to be good. So this is why we need to involve people in the change and not tell them that the change is being done to them, but actually find out what they want from the change and empower them to participate and get their rewards and their benefits from what we're trying to do. This is actually one of the books that first introduced me to a lot of this kind of neuroscience. It's quite old now, about 5 years old. David Rock wrote a book called Your Brain at Work, and he came up with this scarf model. And the idea behind this is, again, it's the limbic brain or the lizard brain, that each of us has a primary motivational type, if you like, and this is the scarf. So we are either motivated by status, so relative importance to others, or certainty, the ability to know what's going to happen next, autonomy, how much control. He says over events there, I kind of feel like it's often about how much control you have over your own choices in the working environment. And then relatedness, like that kind of community, social aspect, and then fairness. And then what David's research shows is that, say you're an autonomy person, which I think I am, thank you. If you're an autonomy person and somebody tries to, for example, micromanage me or try and control me on a kind of granular level, that creates that cortisol production again, so that kind of like tense stress feeling. On the other hand, if I'm allowed to go out and do things and discover things and deliver things and get lots of feedback that's positive, I get lovely boosts of the happy hormone, the dopamine hormone. So the last one I wanted to talk to you about today were these mirror neurons. So we've understood now more about the people around us, how they learn, how we retain information, how hard it is to change information, the kind of factors in our surrounding culture that can impact our ability to change and adopt these new capabilities, whether they are building a continuous delivery pipeline or using some new application performance management tooling or practicing behaviour-driven development. There are lots of things that can inhibit the take-up of those changes that we want. But if we are somebody trying to influence other people, it's really worth knowing about mirror neurons. And mirror neurons are the ones that basically, you do something and I do the same. You smile at me, I smile. I used to get my dinner and start eating, and my cat used to look at me and go, oh, I think I'll have my dinner as well. You can see a little picture here. So it's kind of this kind of unconscious, you can't control it, response to how people are behaving to you. So if you are a leader trying to influence people in change, one of the things you might want to consider is kind of being mindful of your demeanour and your activities. So to kind of bring that all together, I know it was quite soft compared to telling you how a tool might integrate with another tool or something like that today, but our kind of top tips in terms of what we've learned from this neuroscience is, as somebody that is trying to be part of the change in the organisation you work with, you can be conscious and mindful of what's going on in your brain, and that will really help you kind of understand why you're reacting in certain ways and why the people around you are reacting in certain ways. It would encourage you to take time to figure out how other people feel they want to be rewarded, because we're not all the same. It's very easy to get frustrated with people and talk to other people about how frustrating other people are without really trying to understand what's going on. But neuroscience and looking kind of beyond the behaviour into the brain can give us a clue about why people are being difficult or obstructive or just not thinking the same way that we are thinking. You can create psychological safety. One of my favourite examples of this came from the DevOps Enterprise Summit last year. With Capital One, we're talking about how they were doing dojos, and they had a product owner and a technical person that set up the dojos. They did them twice, and each time they got the teams into the dojo, John, the product owner guy, said, this is going to get messy. So they immediately set a stage for psychological safety. They knew it was going to be difficult. They knew there was going to be turbulence and challenges and questions, but they also knew that when they came out the other side, they would be in a better place. And then finally, really, is about being the change that you want to see or modelling the behaviour you want to see. There are mirror neurons at play. So if you want to lead the change, be cognizant that you have to have the passion, enthusiasm, motivation, and need to kind of keep smiling. So I have already popped these on SlideShare if you wanted to download any of them. But thank you very much for your attention today. I'm around for a few minutes if you want to have a chat. Other than that, I think it's now break time. Yeah, thank you very much.